Prince William just stunned the entire United Kingdom by finally shattering 4 years of ironclad silence, standing beside a trembling Catherine, Princess of Wales, inside the pale blue drawing room of Adelaide Cottage, to deliver a devastating revelation the palace machinery had spent years suffocating beneath layers of orchestrated distraction. For nearly half a decade, the world had whispered, speculated, and cruelly theorized about the youngest Wales child, Prince Louis, why his appearances were rationed with surgical precision, why certain balconies remained conspicuously incomplete, why a boy so beloved by the British public had been quietly withdrawn from the machinery of royal spectacle. Tonight, in a broadcast that hemorrhaged across 22 million screens simultaneously, the future King and Queen of England were breaking a solemn parental vow, a promise sworn in the agonizing weeks following a private diagnosis, sealed in the hushed corridors of Great Ormond Street, and guarded by a fortress of NDAs, palace protocol, and the ruthless apparatus of the firm itself. What exactly had the royal doctors discovered in that cavernous, hauntingly quiet consultation room in the autumn of 2022? Why had the late Queen Elizabeth II, in one of her final lucid conversations with her grandson, explicitly forbidden the announcement of what she called the boy's private storm? And what dark, hidden institutional betrayal had finally compelled a weeping Princess of Wales to look directly into the lens and whisper the 7 words that would fracture the crown's carefully constructed illusion forever? The drawing room at Adelaide Cottage was cloaked in the pale, silvery hush of an early November evening, the kind of thin, watery light that seeps through mullioned windows and settles like frost upon Persian rugs. Beyond the tall sash windows, the manicured gardens of Windsor lay in a suspended breathlessness, the last copper leaves clinging to the ancient oaks as though they too were reluctant to fall. Inside, a single mahogany writing desk had been drawn near the marble fireplace, its surface bearing 3 objects arranged with almost sacramental precision. A cream-colored envelope sealed with crimson wax and stamped with an unfamiliar crest, not the Wales insignia, not the Windsor arms, but something older, quieter, more personal. A small tarnished silver locket resting on a velvet pad, and a slim leather-bound journal whose spine bore the faded gilt initials EAMW. The scent of aged paper mingled with the smoke of applewood embers, and dust motes drifted lazily through the cathedral of light like tiny suspended witnesses. William stood behind the desk in a charcoal suit, his tie loosened, his eyes red-rimmed and hollowed out by nights of sleeplessness. Catherine sat beside him in a soft navy dress, her hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone bone-white, a single strand of pearls trembling almost imperceptibly against her throat. Somewhere deep within the walls of the cottage, a grandfather clock ticked with the measured, indifferent rhythm of a mechanism that had witnessed centuries of royal grief. The producer, a veteran BBC correspondent named Marcus Holloway who had covered 3 royal weddings and 1 royal funeral, stood just off camera with sweat beading at his temples despite the November chill, his earpiece squawking with increasingly frantic instructions from an encrypted line traced back to Buckingham Palace communications. Twice already in the past 40 minutes, the satellite uplink had experienced what the technical crew euphemistically called unexplained interference. Twice already, a senior palace operative, a man in his 60s with cold pewter eyes, polished Oxford shoes and a clipboard that never left his grip, had attempted to walk onto the set and postpone the broadcast on grounds of sovereign protocol. And twice, William had personally, quietly, and without raising his voice, ordered the man to leave. The signal was holding. The nation was waiting. And across pubs from Edinburgh to Cornwall, from the working men's clubs of Newcastle to the wine bars of Chelsea, pint glasses had frozen mid-air as landlords fumbled with remote controls, cranking the volume until every screen in the country flickered with the same devastating tableau. William drew a slow breath, and when he spoke his voice was growly, weighted, cracked at the edges like porcelain that had survived one impact too many. "For 4 years," he began, and had to pause, swallowing hard. "The world has spoken for our son. The tabloids have speculated. The columnists have theorized. The palace apparatus has issued its measured, sanitized statements. Tonight Catherine and I are speaking for him, because he cannot yet speak for himself, and because someone inside these walls, has spent the better part of 3 years actively working to ensure he never would." A muscle jumped in his jaw, Catherine's eyes glistened, and in that suspended moment, 22 million Britons collectively understood that whatever was coming next would rewrite everything they thought they knew about the House of Windsor. Catherine reached across and placed her hand over her husband's, and when her voice came, it was soft, trembling, and utterly steel cord beneath the tremor. On the 14th of September, 2022, 6 days after Her Majesty's passing, and while the nation was still swathed in mourning, Louis was taken by private car from Kensington Palace to a specialist pediatric unit at Great Ormond Street. He was 4 years old. He had been experiencing episodes for nearly 7 months, episodes that our previous team had dismissed as behavioral, as tantrums, as the ordinary storms of a spirited little boy. She drew a shuddering breath. They were not tantrums. They were absent seizures. My son, our beautiful, brilliant, mischievous Louis, was diagnosed with a rare pediatric neurological condition, and the Palace Communications Office made the decision, without our consent, to bury that diagnosis beneath the machinery of state mourning. The words landed like a struck bell. Somewhere in the technical booth, a young sound engineer audibly gasped. Marcus Holloway's clipboard slipped from his fingers and struck the parquet floor with a hollow clap that seemed to echo across an entire kingdom. And in a modest terraced house in Bucklebury, an elderly woman named Carol Middleton, watching alone with a cup of untouched tea gone cold in her lap, pressed a hand to her mouth and began to weep silently for a grandson whose private storm she had held in confidence for 1,147 days. William's mind, in that instant, was not in the drawing room. It was 15 months prior, in the autumn of 2022, in a room he would never forget as long as he drew breath. The consultation suite at Great Ormond Street had been painted a soft duck-egg blue, and the pediatric neurologist, a woman named Dr. Priya Ashworth, who had trained under some of the finest minds in Europe, had spoken in that particular tone reserved for the delivery of news no parent is ever prepared to receive. He remembered the scent of institutional antiseptic layered over the faint sweetness of the crayon Louis had been clutching. He remembered Catherine's hand crushing his beneath the table until her wedding ring left a bruise he would find days later. He remembered his son, oblivious, humming a tune from a children's program and drawing what he cheerfully declared was a dragon eating Papa's crown. He remembered the terrifying, disorienting sensation of the floor tilting beneath his polished Oxfords as Dr. Ashworth said the words, rare, manageable, requires strict environmental controls, absolutely must avoid high-stimulation public exposure during the calibration period. And he remembered, above all, the walkout of that consultation room, into the corridor, where a man he had not summoned was already waiting, a man in a charcoal suit with a clipboard and pewter eyes, who introduced himself simply as an advisor from the private secretary's office, and who, before William had even processed the diagnosis, was already speaking in low, measured tones about the necessity of a controlled communication strategy, and protecting the line of succession from unfortunate optics. The name of that man, for he did have a name, though he had spent 40 years ensuring it never appeared in a single printed column, was known within the deepest corridors of the palace as one of the men in grey. He was not a royal. He had never worn a crown, nor sworn a coronation oath, nor stood upon a Buckingham Palace balcony. He was, in the parlance of Whitehall veterans, an invisible architect, a senior courtier of the old school, a man who had begun his career in the mid-1980s as a junior press secretary, and had, through 4 decades of ruthless calculation, risen to become one of 3 men who effectively controlled the narrative machinery of the modern monarchy. His polished Oxfords had walked corridors that stretched from the Diana years through the Charles and Camilla reconstruction, through the Meghan crisis, and now, chillingly, into the private medical file of a 4-year-old boy. His cold eyes had watched the coffin of one princess lowered into the earth at Althorpe, and they now watched, without blinking, as another princess was pressured to smile through the suffocating machinery of institutional silence. He came to us, Catherine continued, her voice steadying now with the strange calm of a woman who has passed through the eye of the storm, in the 3rd week of September. William had barely slept. I had barely eaten. Louis was on his 2nd medication trial. And this man, this senior advisor, whose name I will not speak aloud tonight because to speak it would be to grant him a legitimacy he has never earned, sat in our drawing room and told us, in the gentlest possible terms, that any public disclosure of Louis's diagnosis would be, quote, catastrophically destabilizing to the incoming reign. He suggested that the boy be gradually withdrawn from public engagements. He suggested that photographs be curated to minimize any possible visual evidence of neurological episodes. He suggested that even his siblings not be informed of the full clinical picture, lest they inadvertently mention it to a school friend. Her eyes glittered with a fury that 4 years of enforced grace had polished to a diamond edge. He suggested, in short, that we hide our son. The camera lingered on her face, and across the nation, something shifted. In a Glasgow flat, a nurse who had just come off a 12-hour shift crossed herself. In a Cardiff pub, a man who had loathed the monarchy for 30 years found himself, inexplicably, wiping his eyes with a beer mat. And in a suite at Clarence House, a monarch who had spent his life navigating the same suffocating machinery listened to his son and daughter-in-law with a stillness that could have been shame, could have been sorrow, could have been the terrible, belated recognition of a pattern he had watched consume his first wife 28 years prior. For it was Diana, of course, who had seen it first. Diana, who had walked these same manicured corridors in the summer of 1995, and who had, in a private letter to a trusted confidant that had never been made public, written a warning so precise, so mathematically prophetic, that when William finally read it in the private archive at Kensington Palace in the spring of 2023, he had felt the blood drain from his face and his breath catch in his throat like a hooked fish. The letter had been dated the 12th of August, 1995, the exact anniversary, 27 years later, of the day Louis had experienced his first documented seizure. And in that letter, in Diana's looping, generous hand, she had written of her fear that the men in gray who currently orbit my boys' futures will one day, when the moment presents itself, treat a child's private suffering as a public relations inconvenience to be managed, minimized, and if necessary denied. They did it to me. They will do it to my grandchildren. And someone in this family will one day have to break the machinery, or the machinery will break them. William's throat worked. He reached, now, for the small tarnished silver locket on the velvet pad. He turned it in his fingers, and the applewood firelight caught the delicate engraving of a swallow in flight, the same swallow motif his mother had loved, had embroidered onto handkerchiefs, had drawn in the margins of her letters, had chosen as a private emblem of freedom and flight, in the years when she had felt most caged. Inside the locket, when he opened it with a soft mechanical click that carried across the microphones like the snap of a rifle bolt, was a folded fragment of paper no larger than a postage stamp. Diana's handwriting. 4 words. "Protect the small one, my mother," William said, and his voice broke openly now, unashamedly, in front of a nation that had never quite been permitted to see him weep. Wrote those words in the spring of 1996. She placed them inside this locket. She gave the locket to my grandmother, Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth, with the instruction that it be given to me on the day I most needed it. My grandmother, in her wisdom, held that locket for 26 years. She placed it in my hand on the 2nd of September, 2022, 6 days before her passing, and 12 days before Louis's first seizure, and she said to me, in a voice so quiet I had to lean close to hear it, "William, dear boy, they will try. When the moment comes, they will try. Do not let them." The nation stopped breathing. Somewhere in Buckingham Palace, an encrypted line went dead. Somewhere in the Cabinet Office, a special advisor to the Prime Minister set down his phone and stared at the wall. Somewhere in a modest Fulham flat, a retired pediatric consultant who had signed a non-disclosure agreement in October 2022 felt the crushing weight of 3 years of enforced silence finally, mercifully lift. Catherine took over now, her hand still resting on her husband's, and she spoke of the small things. She spoke of the mornings when Louis, groggy from a nocturnal episode, would climb into their bed and ask, in the plaintive voice of a small boy who cannot understand why his own body sometimes leaves him, whether he was broken. She spoke of George, at 9 years old, quietly researching his brother's condition on a school library computer, and coming home to ask his mother if there was anything he could do to help. She spoke of Charlotte, fierce and protective and 8 years old, who had once physically stood between Louis and a photographer's lens at a garden event because she had noticed her brother's eyes going distant in the way that always preceded an episode. She spoke of the medications, the specialists, the sleep studies, the private tutors who had been brought in when full-time schooling became too much, the nights she had rocked her youngest son in her arms while he cried and asked why the other children got to go to the balcony and he had to stay inside. And she spoke of the moment, 6 months prior, when Louis had asked her, with the shattering directness of a 5-year-old, whether the reason he had to hide was because the palace people think I'm not good enough to be a real prince. There was a sound in the drawing room then. A sharp, involuntary intake of breath from a technician behind the camera, quickly muffled. And beyond the walls of Adelaide Cottage, beyond the manicured hedges of Windsor, across a kingdom of 67 million souls, 22 million viewers heard a mother describe a wound so tender and so specifically inflicted that the collective public conscience of Britain fractured cleanly down the middle. At precisely 8:47 in the evening, the antique rotary phone on the far side of the drawing room began to ring. It was a landline that had not been connected to an active exchange in over a decade. A decorative piece, a nostalgic artifact. And yet it rang, sharp and insistent, with the mechanical urgency of a device that had been quietly, secretly rewired for a single anticipated call. William looked at Catherine. Catherine nodded. William crossed the room, lifted the heavy Bakelite receiver, and pressed it to his ear. The nation watched. The cameras held. And across the crackling line, a voice came through that had been described, in the intelligence briefings of 3 prime ministers, as one of the most recognizable in the English-speaking world, a voice now stripped of its sovereign authority, cracked open, raw as a wound. "William." A pause. A shuddering breath. "William, I did not know. I want you to know, my dear boy, I did not know the extent of it. He acted without my authorization. He acted on his interpretation of what he called the institutional interest, and he will be gone by morning. The King of England was weeping on the other end of the line. And his son, the future king, closed his eyes and for one long suspended moment did not answer. When William finally spoke, his voice was gentle, but there was iron beneath it. "Papa, I know you did not know, but you must understand that the machinery which hid this from you, the same machinery that hid so much from my mother, cannot survive another generation. It ends here, tonight, on this broadcast, with Louis." The line went silent. And then, softly, brokenly, the King of England said, "Then let it end." The receiver was placed back into its cradle. William returned to the desk. And what happened next would be replayed, dissected and studied by historians for a century to come. He picked up the cream-colored envelope with the crimson wax seal. He broke the seal with a soft, decisive crack that carried through the microphones like the snap of a bone. He unfolded the letter within, and he began to read aloud, not from Diana this time, but from Louis. A letter dictated by a 5-year-old boy to his mother, 3 weeks prior, in preparation for this very night, because Catherine and William had made the extraordinary decision that their son's story would not be told about him but by him. The handwriting was Catherine's, transcribing faithfully, but the words, the halting, luminous, impossibly brave words, were Louis's alone. "Dear everyone in Britain," William read, his voice cracking on the second word. "My name is Louis Arthur Charles. I am 5 years old and I have something called epilepsy, which means sometimes my brain goes on holiday without asking me first. It is not scary if you know about it. It is only scary if people keep it a secret. I would like to not be a secret anymore. I would like to meet other children who have brains like mine. I would like to wave from the balcony sometimes even if I am tired. I would like people to know that I am not broken. I am just Louis. Thank you. Love from Louis." There was, in that drawing room, a silence so complete that the ticking of the grandfather clock became a thunderous heartbeat. Catherine was weeping openly. William's shoulders shook. And across the United Kingdom, 22 million people wept with them, in taxis idling at red lights, in hospital break rooms, in living rooms where 3 generations sat crammed onto sagging sofas, in a small terraced house in Bucklebury where a grandmother finally set down her cold tea and whispered, "Brave boy, brave, brave boy." But the revelation was not yet complete. For William reached now for the third object on the desk, the slim leather-bound journal with the faded gilt initials EAMW, Elizabeth Alexandra Mary Windsor, his grandmother's private journal, a book whose existence had been rumored in royal biography circles for decades, but which had never been confirmed to exist, let alone read by any living soul outside the immediate family. He opened it to a page marked with a slender silk ribbon, and he read one final entry, dated the 3rd of September, 2022, 5 days before the late Queen's passing. "Today I gave William the swallow locket. I told him what his mother told me 30 years ago, that the men in grey will one day come for the small one. I have watched this happen 3 times in my reign. I watched it happen to Margaret. I watched it happen to Diana. I watched it nearly happen to Harry. I will not live to watch it happen to Louis, but William will. And William, unlike his father, unlike his uncles, unlike the sovereigns before him, has the strength to break the machinery rather than serve it. I have faith in him. I have faith in Catherine. I have faith that this family, at long last, will choose a child's truth over an institution's comfort. God save the small one. God save them all." William closed the journal. He closed his eyes, and a single tear traced a clean silver path down his cheek. The senior advisor, the man in the charcoal suit, the invisible architect of 4 decades of institutional cruelty, was, at that precise moment, being escorted from his office in a discreet wing of Buckingham Palace by 2 members of the Royal Protection Command. His clipboard had been confiscated. His encrypted phone had been seized. And by dawn his name, a name the nation would learn only in the meticulous parliamentary inquiry that would follow, would be entered into the historical record not as an architect of the monarchy's survival, but as the last of a dying breed of courtiers whose reign of shadow had finally, mercifully been broken by the courage of a 5-year-old boy, and the parents who refused to hide him any longer. Catherine reached for Louis's letter. She folded it with reverent care. She placed it inside the swallow locket, alongside Diana's 4 words, and she snapped the locket closed with a soft, mechanical click that sounded, to the 22 million witnesses, like the sealing of a promise across 3 generations of women who had loved and lost and fought within the same gilded cage. She would give the locket to Louis in the morning, she said softly to the camera. He would keep it beside his bed. And when he was older, when he was ready, he would understand that his private storm had been the moment his family finally chose truth over machinery, love over legacy, a child's small voice over the thunderous silence of an ancient institution. William stood. He helped Catherine to her feet. They faced the camera together, hand in hand, and William delivered the final words of the broadcast in a voice that was no longer cracked, no longer trembling, but calm, clear, and utterly sovereign. To every parent watching tonight who has a child with a hidden condition, you are not alone. To every child watching who has ever been told, by word or by silence, that some part of you must be kept out of sight, you are not broken, you are not a secret, you are loved. And to those within these walls who still believe that a child's suffering is a public relations problem to be managed, your time is over. It ended tonight. It ended with Lewis. The camera held on their faces for 3 full seconds. And then, without music, without commentary, without the customary sign-off of the BBC announcer, the broadcast cut to black. Across the United Kingdom, 67 million souls sat in stunned, reverent silence. In pubs and hospital wards, in cabinet offices and terraced houses, in Balmoral and Buckingham, and a small ivy-covered cottage in Norfolk where a retired pediatric consultant finally wept for the first time in 3 years, the nation held a single collective breath. Somewhere in Windsor, a small boy in dinosaur pajamas, who had been permitted to stay up past his bedtime for the very first time in his life, turned to his mother, tugged her sleeve, and asked, with the sleepy sincerity of a child who had just heard his own words spoken to a kingdom, whether he had done well. Catherine gathered him into her arms. She pressed her lips to his forehead, and she whispered the 7 words that had, only an hour before, fractured the crown's carefully constructed illusion forever. "You did beautifully, my brave small one." The swallow had finally flown free. The machinery had finally been broken, and in the pale, silvery hush of a November evening at Adelaide Cottage, the truth of a 5-year-old boy had, at long last, saved not only himself, but every hidden child the House of Windsor had ever tried to keep out of the light. The secret was out. The small one was seen. And the kingdom, at long last, was silent.